In this video, we will discuss epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is composed of cells that are compacted, closely attached to one another. As we look at epithelial tissue, we will see that the thickness of the epithelial tissue will vary. And we also notice with our epithelial tissue that it is going to have a top and a bottom. So that's really what makes epithelial tissue different from the other tissue types. Epithelial tissue is responsible for covering all of our body's surfaces, forming the outermost portions of our skin, our epidermis. And then the epithelial tissue is also going to line body cavities. Our glands, for the most part, are made of epithelial tissue. One key characteristic to note is that epithelial tissue is avascular. It does not contain any blood vessels. And my silly way for remembering this is when you get a paper cut and you only barely cut through that top part of your skin, which is made of epithelial tissue, it doesn't bleed. It may hurt because there's nerves there, but there are no blood vessels in that epithelial tissue. So let's talk a little bit more about epithelial tissue. The functions of epithelial tissue are shown here. It protects deeper tissues. It secretes mucus, sweat, hormones, dependent upon where that tissue is located. Some epithelial tissue excretes, which means to put off or give off something. It also absorbs, which means that some epithelial tissue has the function of pulling something in. It can serve as a filtration system. And as I said, epithelial tissue does have nerve endings, so it provides sensation. This is probably one of the most important slides that you can learn when you're thinking about what you need to know about epithelial tissue. The cells are packed closely together, avascular, no blood vessels, high rate of mitosis, which means the cells can reproduce. And as I said, it has a top and a bottom. The basement or basal layer is a basement membrane. So what we'll see with this epithelial tissue is we have an actual basement membrane, and then the cells are going to be attached to that basement membrane. So the basement membrane is what we consider the bottom, which means there'll be some other tissue types, connective tissue underneath. And then opposite of the basement membrane is the top, and that's what we're going to call our apical surface. Those definitions are shown here on this slide. Basal surface is the bottom facing the basement membrane. Apical surface is the surface that faces away. Lateral would be anything side to side. So when we're looking at epithelial tissue, they exist as one of three shapes. We have squamous cells that are very flat. Notice with the squamous cell, the only place you really have any thickness is where the nucleus is located. A cuboidal cell is shaped like a cube, a three-dimensional square. Notice you have the same distance on all four sides from the nucleus. Columnar cells look like a column. They are longer than they are wide. Also notice how the nucleus is pressed and elongated as well. And see here you have a much longer section of the interior of the cell when you're comparing it to the nucleus. Regardless of which of these three types of cells you have, they can exist in three different arrangements. It can be simple, which means it's one layer. It can be stratified, which means it's more than one layer. So see in this picture we have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. Or something in between, which we call pseudo-stratified, because even though they kind of look like more than one layer, notice how the bottom of every cell touches that basement membrane. So now we want to look at each type, starting with our simple epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium. It's a single row of thin, flat cells. Its function is to allow things to rapidly diffuse or move through. It should be logical to you that if we want a tissue to have the function of letting things move through, we need to pick the thinnest type of tissue to do that. We find simple squamous epithelium in the alveoli of the lungs. That's this term. In the glomeruli, which are part of the kidneys, where we want things to just filter through. And then in a few other places, but that's really the main two I want you to recognize. So if we look at this picture at the top, this right here is representing a basement membrane. You can see we have a single layer of thin cells on top. Now simple cuboidal epithelium. So now here we have the basement membrane in the back, this nice square-shaped cell sitting on top, and then notice all this free space. So where it's white, that's the apical surface opposite the basement membrane. Simple cuboidal epithelium is a little bit thicker. Its function is absorption and secretion. These are also going to be our cells that very often produce mucus. So we have simple cuboidal epithelium in many places. Most people remember salivary glands and kidney tubules. At this point, you shouldn't completely understand what the kidney does, but the kidney does both absorption and secretion. So that's why it's kind of the characteristic example of simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple columnar epithelium. So in this picture, notice how you can look for that white area. So here's the basement membrane, drawing it in red. We have the cell, the columnar cell sticking up, and then this would be the apical surface at the top. Simple columnar epithelium is the thickest of the simple type of epithelium. This is going to function in absorption and secretion as well. We find simple columnar epithelium in the GI tract, uterus. Notice that simple columnar epithelium very often is ciliated. Sometimes we even see the microvilli. But what this can do is help you look for some type of structure near the apical surface. So in this picture, this is showing you intestinal simple columnar, so those would be microvilli. With the pseudo-stratified columnar, it sort of looks like it's stratified, but pseudo means fake or false. It's not really stratified. You can kind of look at this, it sort of looks like you took the simple columnar epithelium and smushed it together. And so you kind of see alternating nuclei. The pseudostratified columnar has huge cilia when you see the pictures near the apical surface. We find pseudostratified columnar in the respiratory tract and then portions of the male urethra, but that respiratory tract is really the main one you want to remember. This is going to secrete mucus and use those cilia to pull the mucus up your respiratory tract. You'll often hear the term goblet cells. Goblet cells are very specialized ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. So now let's move on to the stratified epithelia. Again, stratified epithelia are the epithelial cells that exist in multiple layers. So as we're getting thicker with these cell types, you should begin to think we're not going to be talking about diffusion or really even secretion and absorption as the function anymore. It's getting thicker. So now we're going to see protection jumping up as more commonly the function of our stratified epithelial cells. With the stratified epithelial cells, we do have that basement membrane, and then the cells are stacked on top of each other, regardless of what the shape is. One characteristic we see is that when we have stratified epithelia, the mitotic cells are actually here at the bottom. So the cells are going to regenerate from the bottom out towards that apical surface. Looking at the most common type, the stratified squamous epithelia, it can exist as a keratinized or non-keratinized form. Keratinized means it has keratin, a waterproofing, very tough protein put into the cells. We see that on the surface of our skin. And then non-keratinized would mean you just don't have that really tough protein stuck in there. Here's a picture of your keratinized, stratified squamous epithelia. So when you take a look at this, you'll learn to be able to see the differences. Here is your basement membrane. All of the cells extending outward are are stratified squamous epithelium. Notice how it starts getting really, really thick and a little clear looking here. That's where you start seeing more of that keratin put in. This picture is actually the heel of a foot, so it would even be considered thick skin. Its job is protection. It protects you against abrasion, just actual rubbing or roughness, keeps you from losing water, and it keeps bad stuff out, keeps bacteria, viruses out. We see this in the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. The non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, you see, looks a little different, doesn't look quite as rough. You can actually see the nice basement membrane here. And then notice the cells get flatter and flatter as they come to the outside, but they don't have that big, thick keratinized layer on the outside. We're still looking at stratified squamous epithelium, so we're resisting abrasion. It's just not going to have as much of the waterproofing ability because it does not have the keratin in there. We have stratified squamous epithelium on our tongue, inside of our mouth, inside of the esophagus, and inside of the vagina. There are other types of stratified epithelia. There is a stratified cuboidal, much more rare, very specialized functions, things such as producing sperm within the seminiferous tubules, helping to move eggs within the ovarian follicles. So more rare, but we can still look at the picture and see. Here's that nice basement membrane. And notice how you have nuclei sitting on top of each other. That's how you know it can't just be simple cuboidal. It must be stratified cuboidal. And then the last one to look at is a very specialized type of stratified epithelium called urothelium, or sometimes transitional epithelium. This is found in really one major place in the body, and that is the bladder. They look like stratified or layered cells that are more round. And if you think about what the bladder has to do, the bladder has to be shrunken down cells, and then as it fills with urine, they have to have the ability to swell and store and hold on to that urine until you're ready to expel it from the body. So this specialized stratified epithelium is only found in that one place. This concludes our discussion of epithelial tissue. Remember, You're going to identify the tissue first by finding the basement membrane, then looking to see if you've got a single layer or multiple layers, and then look for your cell shape. For each tissue type, you need to learn to identify, know the function, and know the common locations.